And I really felt from the Lord that even though a lot of wrong had been done to me, that I was to stand firm in the position that God had called me to and to not walk.
The internet is reeling after Jonathan and Suzy Lamb dropped a bombshell that no one saw coming. Their shocking revelation has pulled back the curtain on Joni Lamb's world, leaving fans stunned and critics circling. For decades, Joni has been a powerful voice and a familiar face, but now her reputation stands on the edge of collapse. What Jonathan and Suzy revealed is not just gossip, it's a scandal that could permanently change the course of her career. It began quietly, almost like a whisper in the dark, the kind of family tension that most people would never imagine spilling into the public eye. For years, the Lamb family had carried an image of strength, unity, and unwavering faith. To millions of viewers who tuned into Daystar, they were not just a family, but a living testimony of God's favor and guidance. That image shattered the day Jonathan and Suzy Lamb stepped forward with their story. What they revealed was not a minor dispute or a clash of personalities. It was an accusation so devastating that it tore the family's carefully polished reputation into pieces.
Right now, Suzy and I are at an undisclosed location because we simply do not feel safe at our home. Now, please know that not only has Julie Roys been given all of the evidence and is writing a story that will be out soon, multiple national reporters have been given all of the evidence as of this afternoon.
According to Jonathan, the breaking point came during a family retreat in Florida in August 2021. What should have been a time of rest turned into a nightmare. He said he walked into a room and saw something no father should ever see: his young daughter, unclothed, with a family member named Pete. Shock and disbelief collided with rage and terror in that moment. The picture of a close, God-fearing family was replaced by an unbearable question. Was their child the victim of abuse, and had the warning signs been ignored? At first, their daughter had struggled to describe what had happened, leaving them grasping at fragments of truth that felt too horrifying to accept. But Jonathan and Suzy could no longer stay silent. They believed they had to act, not only as parents, but as protectors. Their decision to go public was not taken lightly. They claimed that when they brought their fears to Joni, the matriarch of the family and the face of Daystar, instead of comfort, they were met with silence and pressure to keep things within the family. For Jonathan and Suzy, that was betrayal. They had expected arms wide open, a grandmother willing to defend her granddaughter at all costs. What they felt they got instead was an attempt to protect a ministry's image, even if it meant burying the truth. From that moment, their lives were no longer the same. They left their home, moving to an undisclosed location, claiming they no longer felt safe. And with heavy hearts, they handed their evidence not just to Christian journalist Julie Roys, but to national reporters as well.
They should be reporting some stories that will be out in the news very shortly.
We never dreamed this would be our lives. We begged God for months and months that he would take it any other route. But we have to obey in the end. And if he says, you know what, you're the ones who have to speak, it's the harder road. It would have been easy to just walk away. But if he says, I'm calling you to do this, we have to do this. And it's been a challenge, but he has led us every step of the way, and he has given us so much.
The day they spoke out, the whispers turned into headlines. The image of a united Christian dynasty cracked in full view of the world. What had once been seen as a beacon of faith was suddenly being dissected as a story of secrecy, betrayal, and hidden wounds. And just like that, the scandal began, not as a rumor, but as an explosion that no one could silence. When the storm first broke, all eyes turned to Joni Lamb. For years, she had been the face of Daystar, the steady voice guiding viewers through faith, family, and life's challenges. She had built her image on strength, authenticity, and unshakable belief. So when Jonathan and Suzy came forward with their accusations, the question was not just what had happened within the family, but how Joni would respond. She chose her battleground carefully. Rather than stepping into a neutral press conference or granting an interview to outside media, she sat in front of her own cameras on her own show, where she had always been in control of the message. There she looked directly into the lens and spoke with tears in her eyes. I never covered up anything. Marcus never covered up anything. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. For her supporters, it was enough. For her critics, it sounded rehearsed, defensive, and hollow. Joni framed the accusations as an attack, not just on her character, but on the very ministry she and her late husband had built. She told her viewers that Jonathan was not motivated by justice for his daughter, but by bitterness. According to her, His removal from Daystar and his disappointment at not being chosen to step into his father's shoes had twisted into something darker. What the world was hearing, she insisted, was not the truth, but the result of resentment turned into vengeance. In her telling, the accusations were not only false but deliberately designed to destroy her. She reminded audiences of her decades of service, of her sacrifices for both her family and the ministry. She painted a picture of a mother and grandmother deeply wounded, heartbroken, that her own son would accuse her of betraying her granddaughter. For many of her longtime supporters, this emotional plea reinforced their loyalty. They saw a woman of God under attack, holding fast to her faith in the face of lies.
I just want to encourage you, even though things will look horrible and it looks like turmoil, God always sees the bigger picture. And as long as we obey him, we stand in the truth, we tell the truth, he will take us through. And I know he will, but we do need and thank you for your prayers, because all that said, it has still been a hard journey. So thank you.
But outside her circle, the reaction was far more skeptical. Instead of expressing sorrow for her granddaughter's suffering, critics noticed that Joni focused almost entirely on defending herself. The words, "I never covered up anything," rang less like compassion and more like strategy. People asked why she hadn't encouraged immediate police involvement when the allegations first surfaced. Why had she seemed more concerned with Daystar's reputation than her granddaughter's protection? Joni didn't address those questions directly. She emphasized that authorities had already investigated and found no conclusive evidence, and that the case was only reopened after Jonathan's removal from Daystar. A timing she suggested was no coincidence. To her, this was all proof that she was the target of a smear campaign. She explained that Jonathan had been given a detailed improvement plan while working at Daystar and had refused to follow it. When he was let go, she said, his anger only grew. She even revealed that she had offered to go through mediation with him, hoping to heal the relationship, but he had declined. To her audience, this framed Jonathan as unreasonable, unwilling to reconcile, and more interested in revenge than resolution. Joni's language became more spiritual as the scandal deepened. She told her viewers that the enemy was working overtime to destroy her family and the ministry. She asked for prayers, insisting that God knew her heart and would bring the truth to light. She reminded everyone that her late husband Marcus had also faced accusations and had stood firm until the end, and that she intended to do the same. To those who already believed in her, this framing made sense. It was spiritual warfare, not a family tragedy. Yet critics continued to press. They said her repeated denials without self-reflection only made her seem more concerned with image than accountability. The very qualities that had once made her seem strong now appeared to make her cold. For many, it wasn't about whether she had covered something up intentionally, but whether she had failed morally by putting reputation above responsibility. The longer she spoke out, the clearer it became that she wasn't going to shift her stance. She wasn't going to admit to missteps or even the possibility of error. Instead, she doubled down on her narrative. Jonathan and Suzy were bitter, misled, and wrong. She was innocent, her conscience clear, her faith intact. Letters of support began pouring in. Viewers sent prayers, encouragement, and declarations of loyalty. Some pastors defended her publicly, saying she was being unfairly maligned by her own family. Within the Daystar community, many still saw her as a woman of God who had devoted her life to ministry. But beyond that inner circle, doubts only grew. Former employees began to speak up online, some echoing Jonathan's claims of dysfunction behind the scenes. After the murders, we had protest squadrons and homestead marches, with more than 400 people arrested. Hashtags trended on social media, dividing people into camps, some rallying to defend Joni, others demanding accountability. Each appearance she made, each emotional statement, was dissected by the media. Clips of her crying on air went viral, but instead of evoking sympathy, they often sparked criticism. Commentators said her delivery seemed calculated, that she used the language of faith as a shield. Articles accused her of spiritualizing what was, at its core, a legal and moral issue. For every supporter who saw her as a faithful warrior, there was another who saw her as a leader refusing to face reality. The weight of her response was enormous. By choosing denial and defense, she ensured that the scandal would not fade quickly. The story was no longer just about what had happened in a family retreat or about a single child's disclosure. It had become about leadership, trust, and accountability. The Lamb family drama now stood as a test case for how Christian institutions handle allegations of abuse. Joni seemed to accept that role. She portrayed herself as someone carrying not just her own burden, but the weight of a spiritual battle for the future of her ministry. Whether out of conviction or necessity, she refused to bend. She would not step aside. She would not admit failure. She would fight, even if it meant standing against her own son and the tidal wave of public opinion. For her supporters, this was courage. For her critics, it was arrogance. But for Joni, it was survival. She had built Daystar alongside her husband, nurtured it through decades of growth, and carried it after his death. To her, the idea of losing it all over accusations she insisted were false was unthinkable. So she fought, not with apologies, not with compromises, but with defiance. In the end, Joni's response became as much a part of the scandal as the allegations themselves. She had drawn a line in the sand. She was innocent, Jonathan and Suzy were wrong, and the ministry would endure. Whether that line would protect her legacy or bury it under suspicion remains unanswered. But one thing was certain. The fight for her reputation had only just begun, and Joni Lamb was not backing down. The Lamb family scandal was never just about private pain. From the very beginning, it carried the weight of something larger. Questions that reached far beyond one household and into the heart of faith communities everywhere. At the center of it was a child, a disclosure of abuse, and the choices of adults who were supposed to protect her. And once those choices came to light, the debate over law, morality, and faith could not be ignored. In Texas, the law is not vague on this matter. Anyone who suspects child abuse is legally required to report it to the authorities. It doesn't matter if you're a teacher, a pastor, or a family member. The obligation is the same. It isn't optional. It isn't something to be prayed over first or quietly discussed behind closed doors. It's a mandate designed to protect the most vulnerable. For Jonathan and Suzy, this was clear. They believed they had to act once the situation reached a breaking point, and they claim they did. But their accusations against Joni, that she urged them to keep things quiet for the sake of the ministry, introduced a much darker layer to the story. If true, it wasn't just a moral lapse. It brushed up against the boundaries of legality. The first police investigation eventually closed without charges, largely because the child was unable to give enough detail. Anyone familiar with cases like these knows how common that is. Children are often scared, confused, and unable to articulate their experiences in ways investigators can use. Trauma silences them. But ethically, the responsibility of the adults in their lives doesn't disappear when an investigation falters. That's when support, patience, and transparency matter even more. To critics, Joni's actions looked like the opposite: minimization, deflection, and an overwhelming focus on image. This is where morality and faith collided in the harshest way. Christian leaders often speak about the sacred duty to protect the innocent. Churches preach about the value of children, the importance of truth, and the need for accountability. But in practice, religious institutions have a long, painful history of mishandling abuse allegations. Too often, leaders turn inward, trying to resolve matters in-house, with prayer, counseling, or secrecy. They lean on the idea of forgiveness and reconciliation, sometimes confusing those spiritual principles with a substitute for justice. For many observers, the Lamb family's crisis became another example of this pattern. If Joni had indeed chosen to prioritize Daystar's reputation over transparency, then it raised the haunting question: how many other ministries had done the same? And how many victims had been left without justice because leaders feared scandal more than they feared silence? Inside the Christian community, this debate grew louder. Supporters of Joni said the accusations were exaggerated or fueled by Jonathan's bitterness. They pointed to the closed investigation as proof that there wasn't enough evidence to move forward. But others pushed back hard. Even if the details were disputed, they asked, why wasn't the situation treated with absolute urgency from the start? Why wasn't the instinct to call the police immediately and loudly instead of keeping things in the shadows? To them, it wasn't about what could be proven in court. It was about what was right, what was moral, and what reflected the values Daystar claimed to uphold. For Joni herself, the issue was framed as one of trust. She insisted she had done nothing wrong, that she had never discouraged her son from seeking justice. In her eyes, the narrative was twisted, reshaped to make her look like a villain. But every time she denied, the questions only grew. Why had she seemed more focused on defending the ministry than on comforting her granddaughter? Why had her first public statement centered on her own innocence rather than her family's pain? The lack of direct answers only fueled suspicion. The scandal also forced people to think about accountability in leadership. Religious leaders hold extraordinary power. They guide not only congregations but entire communities of faith. Their words carry weight, their decisions ripple outward into thousands of lives. With that kind of influence comes a responsibility to lead with integrity, even when it hurts. And yet, too often, institutions close ranks to protect their own. Daystar, with its massive global reach, had been built on the promise of authenticity. Viewers trusted the Lamb family to speak truth and model it in their lives. But when the accusations surfaced, that trust cracked. Suddenly, people weren't just questioning one decision, they were questioning whether the entire culture of the ministry had been compromised. If image mattered more than innocence, then what did that say about the heart of the organization? The ethical questions weren't confined to Daystar. They rippled out into the wider Christian world. Pastors debated it from pulpits, congregations whispered about it in Bible studies. Some argued that this was spiritual warfare, a family torn apart by the enemy's lies. Others said it was a wake-up call, proof that faith communities must do better at holding leaders accountable. Either way, the conversation was unavoidable. The longer the scandal dragged on, the more the weight of morality pressed in. At its core, this was about more than a family feud or even a legal case. It was about whether faith institutions truly lived by the values they preached. Did they stand by the vulnerable, or did they shield themselves from shame? Did they choose truth, even when it hurt, or did they choose silence when it was convenient? Jonathan and Suzy's decision to go public with their fears was, to many, a radical act of obedience to conscience. They said God had called them to speak out, no matter the cost. For Joni, the entire ordeal was an attack on her character, her ministry, and her legacy. Both sides stood convinced they were walking the path of truth, but in between them lay the bigger questions about law, morality, and the credibility of Christian leadership. Even now, those questions hang heavy. Did Joni fail in her duty as a grandmother and a leader? Did she allow fear of scandal to outweigh the cry for justice? Or was she, as she claims, the victim of a false narrative spun out of bitterness? The courts may decide some parts of the story, but the moral verdict has already been written in the minds of many who once looked up to her. And that is the heart of the matter. The Lamb scandal is not just a family story, it's a mirror held up to the church, asking whether the faith it proclaims is strong enough to withstand the truth, even when the truth cuts deep. When Jonathan and Suzy Lamb first decided to speak out, they probably imagined their words would cause ripples. What they didn't expect was a tidal wave. What started as whispers in online forums and quiet conversations in church lobbies soon exploded into a full-scale media storm. In just a few weeks, the Lamb family's private tragedy was no longer theirs to contain. It had become a public spectacle, unfolding in headlines, news broadcasts, and endless debates across social media. The story had all the elements that drew attention: a famous Christian family, a powerful ministry, allegations of abuse and cover-up, the drama of parents versus matriarch, faith versus reputation. Reporters love stories that blur the line between sacred and scandalous, and this one was impossible to ignore. From niche Christian outlets to major national networks, everyone wanted a piece of it. And once the cameras turned toward Daystar, there was no turning them away. Jonathan and Suzy's decision to share their story with journalists gave the scandal a stage far larger than church pews or ministry circles. Their emotional interviews, their trembling voices, and even their fear of retaliation were broadcast to millions. News anchors introduced the story with heavy words. Did one of America's most famous Christian families fail to protect their own? Viewers leaned in. Audiences who had never even heard of Daystar suddenly knew the Lamb name. Not for preaching or broadcasting, but for scandal. For Joni, the pressure was unbearable. She had built her life and career on image. To many, she was not just a broadcaster, but a symbol of faith, a woman who had carried her husband's vision after his death and turned Daystar into a powerhouse of Christian media. Now, every word she spoke on her own program was pulled apart by critics. Her tearful denials went viral, but instead of winning sympathy, they often fueled suspicion. People said her tone sounded rehearsed, her words too polished, as if she were defending a brand instead of grieving with her family. Social media made everything worse. Within hours of her broadcasts, hashtags began trending. Some declared support for Jonathan and Suzy, others rallied behind Joni. Former Daystar employees chimed in with stories of their own, some backing Jonathan's version of events, others dismissing it as bitterness. Old clips of Marcus and Joni preaching about integrity and truth resurfaced, but this time they weren't inspiring. They were shared with captions dripping in irony. Did they really mean what they preached? The scandal spread beyond words and opinions. It began to cost money. Donors who had once written checks without hesitation grew hesitant. Some stopped giving altogether. Partner churches, once proud to showcase Daystar content, quietly stepped back. Even advocacy groups outside the Christian world began pointing to Daystar as another example of religious institutions mishandling abuse. The damage wasn't just emotional or reputational. It was practical, financial, and visible. Every attempt Joni made to frame the story as spiritual warfare drew sharper criticism. To her loyal supporters, it was convincing. They saw her as a woman of God under attack, a leader being torn down by lies. But to outsiders, it looked like deflection. Instead of addressing the hard questions, why she hadn't pushed for a police investigation immediately, why she seemed more focused on protecting the ministry than her granddaughter, she leaned on language of faith. For critics, it felt like hiding behind scripture rather than facing accountability. The more she spoke, the deeper the divide became. For her followers, she was a martyr. For others, she was proof of how power can twist even those who claim to serve God. Families argued about it at dinner tables. Churches split in their opinions. Some pastors stood behind her, others condemned her silence. What had once been a network meant to unite Christians suddenly became the source of fierce division. The media seized on that division. Every letter Jonathan wrote to his mother was quoted in headlines. Every denial Joni gave was replayed in clips. The contrast between her polished TV defenses and Jonathan's raw emotion made for compelling drama. For journalists, it wasn't just a story about a ministry anymore. It was a battle for the soul of a family. Documentaries and podcasts soon followed. Investigators dug into Daystar's history, into past controversies surrounding Marcus Lamb, into finances, into staff complaints. What had started as one allegation now opened the door to years of scrutiny. The Lamb family's life, once carefully managed and curated for the cameras, was now exposed and dissected in ways they couldn't control. And that's when the bigger picture came into focus. This wasn't just about one family or one ministry. To many, the Lamb scandal became a symbol of a larger issue: the lack of accountability in religious institutions. If it could happen at Daystar, where else was it happening? How many other ministries were hiding scandals behind closed doors, hoping prayer and secrecy would cover what should have been dealt with in the light?